The city was alive with movement, but not the kind that brought warmth. A biting chill hung in the air, seeping into every corner, as people hurried past with their heads down, wrapped in coats and scarves. In a small, forgotten spot behind a busy cafe, a man sat on a flattened cardboard box, his few belongings tied up in a worn-out bag beside him. His name was John Mitchell, a veteran in his late 60s, his face etched with lines that told stories of a life far harder than most could imagine. His hands, rough and calloused, trembled slightly as he held a small cup of coffee, a gift from a stranger who had paused just long enough to offer it. That simple act of kindness was rare in John's world, a brief moment of warmth in an otherwise cold existence. To everyone else on the street, he was invisible, just another shadow blending into the background of their busy lives. But John hadn't always been this way. Once, he was Sergeant John Mitchell, a leader, a protector, someone people looked up to. Now, he sat alone, his past glory buried under layers of hardship, clinging to the small comforts that kept him going. The coffee in his hands wasn't just a drink, it was a reminder that somewhere, even in this cold, uncaring world, there was still a flicker of humanity. John Mitchell wasn't always the man sitting on the street with a cardboard box for a seat. Years ago, he was Sergeant John Mitchell, a soldier who had served in the military with pride and courage. He had led men into battle, made tough decisions under pressure, and saved lives. His bravery wasn't just something people talked about, it was real, proven in moments of chaos and fear. But when his time in the service ended, the world he returned to didn't feel like the one he had left behind. Friends had moved on with their lives, families grew distant, and the job he was promised never came through. The skills he had learned in the military didn't seem to matter here. Slowly, the life he had known began to unravel. Bills piled up, and the stability he once had slipped away. Before he knew it, John found himself without a home, carrying everything he owned in a worn-out bag. Nights were spent in shelters when there was space, or on the streets when there wasn't. He learned to stretch a single meal, to endure the cold with layers of old clothes, and to keep moving when the world told him he didn't belong. Each day blurred into the next, a cycle of survival with little room for hope. But even in the hardest moments, John held on to the discipline and resilience he had learned in the military. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going, one day at a time. Behind the bustling cafe, John had found a small corner where he could sit unnoticed. The manager, a middle-aged woman with a tired face, sometimes handed him leftovers at the end of the day, a stale sandwich, a half-empty soup container. It wasn't much, but to John it was a lifeline. He never asked for more, never caused trouble. He just sat there, quiet and out of the way, trying to stay warm. But one evening, as the cold bit deeper than usual, the manager's patience ran thin. Customers had started to complain about the homeless man lingering near the cafe. Worried about her business, she made a call to the police. A few minutes later, an officer arrived, his expression serious, but not unkind. He approached John, his voice firm but calm. "Sir, you can't stay here. You're trespassing." John didn't argue. Years of military discipline had taught him to follow orders, even when they felt unfair. He nodded, gathered his few belongings, and stood up slowly. But as he turned to leave, the officer gently grabbed his arm. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his tone softer now. "We've had complaints." John's heart sank. He had hoped, just this once, to be left alone. Instead, he was led to the police car, his head down, his hands trembling slightly. As the car drove away, John stared out the window, the city lights blurring through his tired eyes. He thought about all the nights he had spent like this, alone, forgotten, and unwanted. The world had moved on, and he was left behind, a shadow of the man he used to be. The weight of it all pressed down on him, heavier than the cold ever could. The courtroom was a place of quiet tension, filled with the low hum of whispered conversations and the occasional shuffle of papers. People sat in rows, some nervous, others bored, all waiting for their turn. When John walked in, heads turned. His mismatched jacket and worn-out shoes made him stand out, but not in a good way. He kept his head down, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, trying to ignore the curious glances and muttered comments. To everyone else, he was just another homeless man, another case to be dealt with quickly. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her voice was firm as she called the cases, one after another, her tone leaving no room for argument. When John's name was called, he raised his hand slightly, his throat too dry to speak. The judge glanced at his file, her expression unreadable at first. But then she paused, her eyes narrowing as she read something that caught her attention. She looked up, studying John more closely. "John Mitchell," she said again, this time softer, almost to herself. Her voice wavered slightly as she asked, "Were you in the 80th Airborne Division?" John's eyes widened, and for a moment, he was back in his uniform, standing tall among his fellow soldiers. "Yes, ma'am," he replied quietly, his voice cracking under the weight of memories. The judge leaned back in her chair, her face softening. "My brother served in that division," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He told us stories about a man who saved his life, a man named John Mitchell. That was you, wasn't it?" The room grew still, every eye now fixed on John. He nodded, his hands trembling. "I just did my job, ma'am," he whispered. The judge took a deep breath, her eyes glistening. "This man," she said, her voice strong and clear, "served our country with courage and honor. He doesn't belong here facing charges. He deserves our respect and our help." With that, she dismissed the case and ordered immediate assistance for John. The room erupted in murmurs, but John barely heard them. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a burden, but as someone who mattered. Thank you so much for your patience and for being here with me as we share this story. If you're finding it meaningful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support truly means the world to me, and it helps keep these stories alive. Don't forget to like and share this video to spread its message. Now, let's get back to the story. The judge stood up, her voice steady, but filled with emotion as she addressed the courtroom. "This man," she began, gesturing to John, "is not just another case to be processed. He is a hero. He served our country with bravery and selflessness, risking his life to protect others. And yet, here he stands, not because he failed, but because we failed him." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. She turned to John, her tone softer but no less firm. "Mr. Mitchell, you deserve more than this. You deserve respect, support, and a chance to rebuild your life." The room, once filled with whispered judgments, fell completely silent. People who had glanced at John with pity or indifference now looked at him with something else: admiration, guilt, even awe. The judge didn't stop there. She ordered immediate assistance for John, including temporary housing and access to counseling services. "This court will ensure you get the help you need," she said, her voice ringing with authority. John stood there, his hands trembling, his eyes filling with tears. For years, he had carried the weight of feeling invisible, forgotten, and unwanted. But in that moment, something shifted. The weight began to lift, replaced by a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. He tried to speak, to thank her, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded, tears streaming down his face. The crowd, moved by the judge's words and John's reaction, began to stir. Strangers approached him as he left the courtroom, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service, and offering words of encouragement. For the first time in years, John felt seen, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who mattered. The judge's decision wasn't just about dismissing charges, it was about restoring dignity. And for John, it was the first step toward a new beginning. After the courtroom, John was quickly connected with a veterans outreach program. It wasn't just a place to sleep or eat, it was a chance to start over. The staff listened to his story, not with pity, but with respect. They helped him find temporary housing and set up counseling sessions to address the struggles he had carried for so long. But it wasn't just the practical help that made a difference. At the program, John met other veterans who had faced similar battles. Men and women who, like him, had returned home only to find that the world didn't quite know what to do with them. They shared stories, laughed, and sometimes just sat together in silence, understanding each other in a way no one else could. Over time, John began to find purpose again. He started volunteering, sharing his experiences with younger veterans who were just beginning to navigate civilian life. He became a mentor, someone they could turn to for advice or just a listening ear. It wasn't about being a hero, it was about being there for others, the way he wished someone had been there for him. One day, as he walked through the city, he passed the cafe where his troubles had begun. The manager, the same woman who had called the police that cold evening, recognized him. She hesitated, unsure of what to say. But John simply smiled and nodded. There was no bitterness in his heart, no anger. He had found peace, not just with her, but with himself. The cafe was no longer a place of pain, it was just another part of his journey. And as he walked away, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. After the courtroom, John was quickly connected with a veterans outreach program. It wasn't just a place to sleep or eat, it was a chance to start over. The staff listened to his story, not with pity, but with respect. They helped him find temporary housing and set up counseling sessions to address the struggles he had carried for so long. But it wasn't just the practical help that made a difference. At the program, John met other veterans who had faced similar battles. Men and women who, like him, had returned home only to find that the world didn't quite know what to do with them. They shared stories, laughed, and sometimes just sat together in silence, understanding each other in a way no one else could. Over time, John began to find purpose again. He started volunteering, sharing his experiences with younger veterans who were just beginning to navigate civilian life. He became a mentor, someone they could turn to for advice or just a listening ear. It wasn't about being a hero, it was about being there for others, the way he wished someone had been there for him. One day, as he walked through the city, he passed the cafe where his troubles had begun. The manager, the same woman who had called the police that cold evening, recognized him. She hesitated, unsure of what to say. But John simply smiled and nodded. There was no bitterness in his heart, no anger. He had found peace, not just with her, but with himself. The cafe was no longer a place of pain, it was just another part of his journey. And as he walked away, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. Months later, John received an invitation to speak at a community event honoring veterans. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but he knew his story could make a difference. Standing on the stage, he looked out at the crowd and began to speak. He talked about his time in the military, the struggles he faced when he returned home, and the moments of kindness that had helped him find his way back. His voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of everything he had been through. The audience listened in silence, some wiping away tears as he shared his journey. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. People came up to him afterward, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service, and promising to do more to support veterans like him. It wasn't just about honoring John. It was about recognizing the struggles of all those who had served and making sure they weren't forgotten. Back in his small apartment, John looked around at the life he was slowly rebuilding. On the wall hung a framed photo of his unit, a reminder of the brotherhood he had once known. Nearby was a letter from the judge, thanking him for his service. It wasn't much, but it was his. For the first time in years, John felt like he had a place in the world. And as he sat by the window, sipping a warm cup of coffee, he allowed himself to dream of brighter days ahead. John sat by the window of his small apartment, a warm cup of coffee in his hands. Outside, the city buzzed with life, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was part of it. He looked around at the space he now called home, simple but his. On the wall hung a photo of his unit, a reminder of the past, and a letter from the judge, a symbol of the kindness that had changed his life. He thought about how far he had come, from the cold streets to this moment of quiet peace. It hadn't been easy, but he had made it. And he wasn't done yet. John had found a new purpose, not just in helping other veterans, but in showing the world that everyone deserves a second chance. As he sipped his coffee, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't known in years. The future wasn't just something to survive, it was something to look forward to. John's story was a reminder that resilience, community, and a little kindness can change a life. And for him, that change had just begun.